It was an ordinary evening when I decided to escape the noise of my apartment and head to the library for some peace and quiet. I had grown accustomed to the soothing smell of old books, the creaking of the wooden shelves, and the calming atmosphere of the reading room. There, I could lose myself in words, far away from the distractions of everyday life. As I walked through the aisles, my fingers brushed against the spines of dusty books that seemed to whisper stories from long ago. It was in moments like these that I felt closest to something timeless, something mysterious. I could spend hours here reading, wandering, and discovering. On this particular evening, my eyes fell upon an unassuming book. It wasn't the newest one on the shelf, nor the most worn out. Its cover was plain, a nondescript collection of pages that promised nothing more than another forgotten piece of the past. I took it almost on a whim and sat down at one of the worn leather chairs near the window. The fading light of the evening sun filtered through the glass, casting a warm glow over the room, perfect for reading. I opened the book and began flipping through the pages. The words seemed unremarkable, but they were enough to keep my attention. After a few minutes, I reached a page where something unusual caught my eye. There, wedged between the pages, was a small, yellowed scrap of paper. It looked out of place, a foreign object, in the otherwise pristine book. Curious, I gently pulled it out, feeling a strange sense of anticipation wash over me. It wasn't uncommon to find bookmarks or forgotten receipts in old books, but this felt different. The paper was thin and brittle, its edges torn unevenly, as though it had been hastily ripped from something. The ink on it had faded with time, but the words were still legible. At first glance, it looked like a note hastily scribbled in a rush, the handwriting jagged and uneven, as though the writer had been in a hurry or distressed. I squinted, trying to make sense of the hurried scrawl. The message was fragmented, the sentences abrupt and broken. It read, "He is gone. I don't know where he went. They came for him. If you find this, please help. You have to." The note was cut off abruptly, as if the writer had been interrupted in the middle of writing. It made no sense. There was no name, no explanation, just a cryptic plea for help. My heart began to race, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this was no ordinary note. Why was it hidden in this book? And why had it been left for me to find? I sat there for a long time, staring at the paper in my hands. My first instinct was to dismiss it as some odd relic of the past, a forgotten fragment of someone's troubled life. But something about it didn't sit right with me. The urgency in the words, the cryptic nature of the message, it all seemed too intentional, too specific. It felt like it was meant for someone to find, meant for me to find. But why? Why me? I looked around the library, feeling a slight unease creeping up my spine. The quiet hum of the fluorescent lights overhead seemed to grow louder, the shadows in the corners of the room darker, more oppressive. I looked back down at the note. The more I thought about it, the more questions it raised. Who was the person who had written this? Who were they? And most importantly, who had disappeared? The only way to find out, I realized, was to investigate. I couldn't just ignore it. Something about the note was calling me to uncover the truth. But where did I even begin? The library, while full of information, was not likely to offer any answers. No, I would have to do more. I would have to search for traces of this person who had vanished, follow the trail of this strange message. I folded the note carefully and slipped it into my pocket. As I stood up to leave, a shiver ran down my spine. The air around me felt colder now, and the oppressive silence of the library seemed heavier. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had stumbled upon something significant, something that had been waiting for someone to uncover. With the note tucked safely away, I walked out of the library that evening, my mind already racing with possibilities. But deep down, I knew one thing for sure. My life was about to change. This wasn't just a coincidence. It couldn't be. There was a mystery here, and it was my responsibility to solve it. The next few days felt like a blur. The note had consumed my every thought. I found it difficult to focus on anything else. Each time I closed my eyes, the words seemed to echo in my mind. He is gone. I don't know where he went. They came for him. Who was this person? What had happened to them? And why had this message been left for me? I decided to begin my investigation by returning to the library. It felt like the only place where I could find any clues. The note had come from there, so surely there was more to be discovered. It had to be more than just a random find. When I walked into the library, the familiar scent of aging paper and ink settled around me, but it did little to calm the unease that had taken root in my chest. I could feel the presence of the library's many old books, as if they were watching me. The rows of shelves seemed to stretch on forever, as if they held more than just words, but secrets as well. I made my way to the section where I had found the book, and immediately began scanning the shelves for the same title. I tried to remember every detail about it, the color, the shape of the spine, the size. It took me longer than I expected, but eventually I found it. The book was exactly where I had left it, sitting on the shelf as though nothing had changed. I took the book down carefully, running my fingers over the worn edges of the cover. It felt heavier in my hands than I remembered, almost as if it were burdened with secrets. I opened the book once more, scanning the pages to see if there was anything I might have missed the first time. The pages, though yellowed with age, seemed to hold no further clues. It was then that I noticed something new. Inside the front cover of the book, I spotted a small, faded stamp. It was placed there in ink that had long since begun to fade, but it was still readable. The date was startling, 1974. This book had been checked out nearly 50 years ago, and yet it had found its way back to the library shelf just a few days ago in my hands. How had it gotten there? The book had not been borrowed since that time. I wondered if this was a clue, or just another strange coincidence. But the real mystery lay with the disappearance the note had mentioned. I couldn't ignore the nagging thought in my mind that the person the note spoke of was real, and had been missing for decades. I needed to know more about them. I couldn't just move on. I left the library that afternoon and went straight to the local archives. I knew that this was my next step. If I could find any mention of a disappearance in the area from around the time the note was written, it might lead me to answers. I found a small, dusty section of the archives that housed old newspapers and began scanning through the back issues. The process was tedious, and at first I found nothing of note. But after hours of searching, my eyes caught something. A headline, buried deep within the pages of a local newspaper from the early 1980s, read, "Student missing, last seen with influential figures." My heart skipped a beat as I read the article. The piece was brief, but chilling. It mentioned the disappearance of a university student named James Parker, who had vanished in the fall of 1982. The article stated that he had been last seen in the company of a group of influential figures, names that were familiar to anyone in the town, people who held significant power in both the business and political sectors. The article gave no further details, only that James Parker had been seen entering a car late one evening and was never heard from again. I dug deeper, cross-referencing the name with other articles and sources. The more I searched, the more I realized that Parker's disappearance was not an isolated incident. There were whispers of other disappearances of strange occurrences, but they were all vague, no concrete information, no answers. Every lead I tried to follow seemed to disappear, just like the people who had vanished. I couldn't help but wonder if the influential figures mentioned in the article had anything to do with the mysterious note I had found. The secrecy surrounding these disappearances was too strong to ignore. What had they been hiding? Why had they been involved in these cases? I felt an uncomfortable knot tighten in my stomach. The more I uncovered, the more I felt like I was uncovering a vast conspiracy, one that had been buried for years, just waiting for someone to dig it up. I decided to track down James Parker's family. I had to find out if they knew anything about the strange note or if they had any insight into the disappearance that had haunted their family for decades. I reached out to Parker's parents, who were still living in the area. At first, they were hesitant to speak with me, understandably so. It had been years since their son's disappearance, and they had long given up hope of any resolution. But after some convincing, they agreed to meet. Our conversation took place at a small, modest coffee shop on the outskirts of town. Parker's mother, Helen, had aged considerably, her face drawn with years of grief and sleepless nights. Her husband, Arthur, looked weary but determined. When I mentioned the note I had found, their expressions changed. They were both visibly shaken. Helen leaned forward, her eyes wide with something I couldn't quite place, fear perhaps. "You're not the first to come looking," she said quietly. "We've tried everything. We've gone to the police, the press, but the evidence always seemed to vanish. No one ever cared. It was as though they wanted the truth to stay hidden." Her voice trembled as she spoke, but there was a fire in her words, a fire that had never been extinguished, despite the years of silence. Arthur spoke next, his voice low and heavy with the weight of old memories. "There were rumors," he said. "James was investigating something. He had stumbled upon something big, but no one would listen. And when he disappeared, it was as if the world just erased him. It was as if he had never existed." I left their home that evening with more questions than answers. The weight of their words hung heavy in the air, the lingering sense of injustice too strong to ignore. I knew now that this was no ordinary case. Something sinister was at play here, and I was determined to get to the bottom of it. The search for answers had consumed me. The strange note, the article about James Parker's disappearance, and his parents' chilling revelations. Everything pointed to something far bigger than I had anticipated. There were forces at play here that had been hidden for decades, and I couldn't stop myself from wanting to unravel every thread, no matter how dangerous or unsettling it became. I spent the next several days trying to follow every lead I had uncovered. But despite my efforts, I felt like I was wading through thick fog. The more I searched, the more I realized how carefully this mystery had been buried. Each time I tried to dig deeper, the path seemed to narrow, and every lead I followed either ended in a dead end or in a sudden, inexplicable silence. It started with the phone calls. At first, they were just strange occurrences, nothing that could be firmly tied to my investigation. I would pick up the phone expecting a familiar voice, but instead, there would be nothing, just static and faint sounds in the background. Sometimes, there would be a faint clicking noise, followed by a short burst of breath. It didn't take long for me to realize that someone or something was watching me. The calls came at odd hours, always when I was deep in my research. I couldn't help but feel that they were trying to intimidate me into backing off. But I wasn't about to give up. This wasn't just some strange, isolated incident. It was a conspiracy, and I was determined to find the truth. The first call came late one night, just as I was sifting through more old newspapers. The screen on my phone flashed, showing an unknown number. I hesitated for a moment before answering. "Hello," I said, my voice echoing in the quiet of my apartment. There was a long pause before a voice, distorted and low, crackled through the line. "Stop looking. You don't know what you're getting into." I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. "Who is this?" I demanded, my hand tightening around the phone. But there was no answer, just the unsettling hum of silence. The call ended abruptly. The next day, I visited the police station. I needed answers, and I thought maybe they could help me piece together more of the puzzle. I had already learned that there was no official investigation into James Parker's disappearance, but maybe, just maybe, the police had some insight that wasn't readily available in the public domain. The station was busy, with officers going about their business, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As I approached the front desk, I saw a familiar face, Detective Allen, the same detective who had been assigned to Parker's case all those years ago. His reputation was known around town. He had a sharp mind and an unwavering sense of duty. But as I approached him, I couldn't help but notice the wary look in his eyes. "Detective Allen," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. I've been researching James Parker's disappearance. I was hoping you might be able to help me. There are things that don't add up, and I think—" He cut me off before I could finish. "I know what you're going to say," he said, his voice low and guarded. "But let me make this clear. Parker's case is closed. There's nothing more to investigate. Let it go." His response was abrupt, and his body language was tense, as if he was trying to keep me from asking further questions. But something about the way he said it made my blood run cold. It was as if he already knew something I didn't, and he didn't want me to find out. I tried to press him for more details, but he simply shook his head. "You're wasting your time. There's nothing more to be said about this case." It was clear that Detective Allen wasn't going to help me, but I wasn't ready to give up. I knew that I had to keep digging, and I had to do it carefully. The walls were closing in, and the more I uncovered, the more I felt like I was being watched. Every corner I turned seemed to bring me closer to a dangerous truth. That night, the phone calls intensified. I had received several more over the past few days, each one more ominous than the last. The voice on the other end had become clearer, almost taunting me. "You're getting too close," it whispered. "Back off before it's too late." But I couldn't back off. There was too much at stake now. I had come too far to turn back. And then, the next strange event happened, one that confirmed my worst fears. While researching old articles online, I discovered that all the old forum posts and discussions about Parker's disappearance had begun to vanish. One by one, they disappeared from the internet, as if someone were deliberately erasing them. When I tried to follow the links to the threads, they led to blank pages or 404 errors. It was as though the entire history of Parker's case was being wiped clean. I wasn't imagining it. Something was actively trying to prevent me from uncovering the truth. I could feel the weight of it now, the knowledge that there were powerful people at work behind the scenes, erasing every trace of James Parker's existence, and likely anyone else who had dared to speak up about it. I needed to find someone who could help me. I needed answers, and I knew that the only way to get them was to confront the past head-on, even if it meant exposing myself to danger. That's when I remembered the former journalist, the one who had tried to investigate Parker's case back in the 1980s. He had been silenced, just like everyone else. But if he had survived, then maybe he had information that could help me uncover the truth. The phone calls had become more frequent. I knew they were trying to intimidate me, to force me to back off from the investigation, but I couldn't stop. Something about this case, the secrecy, the manipulation, the way people had tried to erase all traces of James Parker's disappearance, had ignited a fire inside me. I couldn't walk away from it now, not when I was this close to uncovering the truth. I knew I had to meet the former journalist who had tried to investigate Parker's case years ago. If anyone knew about the conspiracy that had shrouded the case, it was him. After all, he had been silenced, just like the others. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that his story could be the key to unraveling the whole mystery. Finding him wasn't easy. He had been out of the journalism game for years, a shadow of his former self. After a few dead ends, I finally tracked him down to a small, rundown bar on the outskirts of town. The place was dark, with a musty smell in the air, and the only sound was the quiet murmur of a few patrons nursing their drinks. I spotted him sitting alone in the corner, his once sharp features now dulled with age and regret. His name was Tom Waters, and I had read about his efforts to investigate James Parker's disappearance in old newspaper archives. Waters had been a rising star in local journalism back in the day, but his career had ended abruptly after his attempts to expose the truth about Parker had been shut down. I approached him cautiously, unsure of how he would react. He looked up at me as I took a seat across from him, his tired eyes studying me for a long moment before he spoke. "You're the one asking about Parker," he said, his voice low and rough, as though the words were being dragged from him. "Yes," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I need your help. I've been looking into the case, and there's something I don't understand. Why was the investigation shut down? Why did everyone just forget about it?" Waters let out a long sigh, his gaze drifting to the half-empty glass in front of him. Forget about it? That's the key, son. That's exactly what they wanted. They didn't want anyone to remember. They didn't want anyone to ask questions. You see, James Parker wasn't just some student who got in over his head. He knew something that could have brought down the most powerful people in this town. My heart skipped a beat as I leaned forward, eager to hear more. What did he know? What happened to him? Waters paused, glancing around the room nervously, as if to make sure no one was listening. James was in the wrong place at the wrong time. He witnessed something that wasn't supposed to be seen. And when he tried to go to the police, well, let's just say that didn't go well. A few days later, he was gone. And the investigation? It was buried. You think it was just a coincidence that no one could find any answers? No, my friend, it was all part of a cover-up. I could feel a chill creeping up my spine as I processed his words. Who was involved in all of this? Who made sure the case was buried? Waters looked around once more, then leaned in closer. His voice dropped to a whisper. I don't know the full extent of it, but I can tell you this. The people involved weren't just some local thugs. These were powerful people with connections that reached far beyond this town. People who had the means to make sure that James Parker's disappearance was erased from history. The weight of his words hit me hard. I had suspected something like this, but hearing it from someone who had been so close to the case made it all the more real. The conspiracy was bigger than I had imagined, and now I was in the middle of it. I had to press him for more details. You mentioned that he was a witness to something. What was it? What did he see? Waters hesitated, his face creased with worry. I don't know exactly what he saw. All I know is that it had to do with a secret, a big one. And when Parker tried to expose it, they made him disappear. The problem is I was getting too close to the truth myself. I started to dig deeper, and that's when they came for me. I was blacklisted. No one would touch my work, and my sources suddenly disappeared. Everything I had uncovered was buried, just like Parker's case. And I just had to walk away. I could see the pain in his eyes, the guilt of a man who had once been passionate about seeking the truth, but had been crushed by the weight of a powerful, hidden force. He had tried to fight, but in the end, he had been silenced. I had to know more. I had come this far, and there was no turning back now. So what can I do? How do I uncover the truth? Waters looked at me with a mix of fear and resignation. You don't want to get involved in this, kid. I'm telling you, there's a reason they've kept this quiet for so long. But if you really want to dig deeper, I'll give you what I have. But be careful. You're dealing with people who won't hesitate to make sure you disappear, just like Parker. I could feel the tension in the air as Waters slid a folder across the table. Inside were old newspaper clippings, handwritten notes, and photographs, fragments of a story that had been erased. I felt a sense of dread wash over me as I picked up the papers, knowing that I was about to delve even deeper into the dangerous secrets of the past. But I couldn't stop now. I had come too far, and the truth was within my reach. Whatever danger awaited me, I had to face it. I wasn't going to back down. As I left the bar, the weight of the folder in my hands, I felt the eyes of the world on me. The phone calls had stopped for now, but I knew they would start again soon. Someone somewhere didn't want me to find the truth. But no matter what it took, I would finish what I had started. The world needed to know what had happened to James Parker, and I was the one who was going to make sure it came to light. The day the media picked up the story, it felt like the world was waking up. What had started as a small, personal investigation, just a handful of old newspapers and a yellowed note, had become something much larger. I had never imagined how much momentum this case would gain once the truth started to slip through the cracks. But now, as the world began to take notice, I couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation settling on my shoulders. I had done what I set out to do. I had collected the evidence, connected the dots, and sent it all to the modern journalists, those who still had the resources and the influence to get things done. But even now, as they began to report on the case, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. Someone who had the power to make sure that everything I had uncovered would disappear again, just like it had all those years ago. The media coverage exploded. It started with local news, a small article in the corner of the evening paper. But within hours it spread. Social media buzzed with speculation, and soon, stories of James Parker's disappearance were making headlines all over the country. People were asking questions, and for the first time in decades, someone was listening. The story had gained traction, and there was no turning back now. It didn't take long for the authorities to react. The police had to act. There was simply too much pressure. After years of silence, they finally reopened the investigation, officially acknowledging the case. But the media frenzy was far from over. The new attention, coupled with the sheer number of people demanding answers, left the police with no choice but to take a closer look. At first, I thought it was all too good to be true. I had expected them to push back, to do everything in their power to suppress the case once again. But this time it was different. The people I had exposed, the powerful figures in this town, the ones who had been pulling the strings for years, were being forced into the spotlight. They couldn't hide anymore. The more I learned, the more terrifying the reality became. The names I had uncovered, the ones that had been associated with James Parker's disappearance. These were not just people with political power or money. These were individuals with influence that reached into every corner of society. High-ranking officials, business tycoons, and even some figures from the local law enforcement. They had all been involved in covering up the truth. But the truth was out now, and the investigation had begun to unravel the web of corruption that had kept Parker's case buried for so long. As the media continued to report, new pieces of the puzzle fell into place, and the picture began to form. The police found more evidence, hidden files, unmarked graves, and a network of people who had all played a part in silencing the student. They discovered connections between the powerful figures I had suspected and criminal organizations, shady business dealings, and a web of lies that stretched back for decades. As the days went on, the pressure mounted. The government officials, who had long been untouchable, were now under scrutiny. Some of them were already being questioned, their carefully curated public images slowly crumbling away. The world began to see them for who they truly were, ruthless individuals who would stop at nothing to maintain their control. A few were arrested, their names dragged through the mud by the media, but some were still in power, still had the ability to influence the situation. They couldn't stop the flood of truth that was pouring out, but they could try to protect themselves. The game was far from over. I had learned that the past had a way of catching up with people, even when they thought they could hide it forever. But there were still a few pieces left to uncover, and I had come too far to turn back now. I had the information, the evidence, and the public's attention. Now all I needed to do was finish what I started. As the investigation deepened, more arrests followed. One by one, the people who had played a role in Parker's disappearance were exposed, and their lives began to unravel. They couldn't hide behind their power anymore. The truth had caught up with them. Some of the individuals who were linked to the cover-up were already dead, victims of time or their own actions. But the rest were forced to face the consequences of their actions, their careers, and their reputations shattered in the face of overwhelming evidence. The case had become a symbol of justice, a symbol that no one, no matter how powerful, was beyond accountability. And for the first time in years, the Parker family began to see the justice they had been denied for so long. But there was something bittersweet about the entire situation. James Parker was still gone. No one had found his body. No one could bring him back. But in some small way, by exposing the people who had silenced him, we had brought a small measure of peace to his memory. I had done what I had set out to do, but the cost had been high. The pressure, the threats, the constant feeling of being watched. It had all taken a toll. But in the end, I knew it had been worth it. James Parker's story had been told, and the people responsible for his disappearance had been brought to justice. And as I sat back and watched the world react to the truth, I couldn't help but feel a sense of closure. The past, for all its darkness and danger, had finally been uncovered, and I had played a part in making sure it never stayed buried again.